Estupendo. Nice, perfect. Thank you so much. Cool. Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is our first webinar as part of our Fish Plus in a Good Food Nation Atlas initiative. It's an initiative that comes from the opportunity that we have in Scotland with the government introducing the Good Food Nation Act. And can you put the next slide, please, Olivia? So this act introduces a vision for Scotland as a good food nation where people from every walk of life take pride and pleasure in and benefit from the food they produce, buy, cook, and serve and eat each day. And as part of this act, a duty has been placed on the national government and the local government to produce national and local food plans for how we will achieve this vision. And so it is just a very exciting opportunity for Scotland right now. And the key thing is that in policy, not just in Scotland, but also in other places, Fish Plus or aquatic foods are often left out of food system discussions. And these tend to be focused more on land-based food production. And additionally, Nourish as an organization that has been working in food systems for over 10 years, we know that many food systems organizations, including ourselves, tend to focus more on land-based food production. So this initiative that we're doing is because we want to make sure that aquatic foods are integrated into policy and food systems work more broadly. And it's just really interesting whenever we speak about this work with anyone, there's just this big surprise that Scotland, as an island nation, in the imagination, we think surely there should be more seafood available, should perhaps be more of a thing. And we know that Scotland produces, for example, a lot of shellfish. And then we also know that many people living in the UK travel to Spain and France to enjoy it. So it brings a bunch of different interesting questions for this vision that we have in Scotland for a good food nation. And particularly as it seeks to make food better for people and planet. It just raises a question of what will the role of Fish Plus be in this vision. And because we know that the nexus is underexplored and we want to help inform food systems policy and practice, what we have decided to do is produce a Fish Plus Atlas, which is basically a publication that will depict the role of Fish Plus in Scottish food systems, including information on what is caught, farmed, where, and by who, and information on people's livelihoods across the sector, nutrition opportunities, where it is on the public plate at the moment, and what are some of the consumption patterns, as well as other topics. And we envision that this will be published beginning of January, but you'll hear more by following Nourish on our newsletter and our socials. But to develop this publication, as I said, Nourish is quite new to this topic. So we put together a steering group of 12 people, bringing together varied expertise that would help us lead the content of the publication. And this steering group includes industry representation, environmental NGOs, workers' rights, community groups, local authority representation, young people, health, and nutrition expertise. Of course, this is not everyone, and it's a really broad sector, and it would be impossible to be absolutely representative. So what we decided to do is to run this series of public webinars where the steering group decides on topics that perhaps we don't hold that much expertise on as a steering group, to help us inform and add more content into the final publication, which is why this first one, we thought it'd be really helpful to have a bit more of a historical background on aquatic foods in Scotland. And why, we're very excited to welcome today two different speakers who will speak on with expertise of aquatic foods in Scotland and the UK. And it felt important to highlight that we're calling it Histories, as we know that there isn't one singular narrative, but a collection of different stories and experiences, and we wanted to bring some of those here today. So we want to warmly welcome John Goodlad and Ruth Thurstan. John is a Shetlander who has worked in the seafood industry throughout his career. For many years, he represented the fishers of the Shetland Islands. He then became a fish farmer, specializing in organic salmon and halibut. More recently, he has worked for the Prince Charles International Sustainability Unit, looking at a variety of global fisheries and aquaculture initiatives. He continues to advise international organizations on seafood sustainability and is also an author who wrote The Salt Roads, as well as Food from the Sea, The Future of Seafood. and Ruth, who is an associate professor at the University of Exeter, where she specializes in marine historical ecology and the long-term trajectories of fish supply. Drawing on archival records and local knowledge, her research explores how our seas and fishing systems have changed due to industrialization and globalization. Ruth brings historical perspectives to contemporary questions about food, fish, and the ocean, using the past to challenge assumptions of what we might want for seafood and seas in the future, and how we might move towards fair and sustainable future for people and marine ecosystems. Can you change slides, please, Olivia? Thank you. So great. Just in time. We're gonna now hear from Ruth first, then we'll hear from John, and then we'll have we wanted to leave a big space of time for questions and discussions, as we know this is quite a new topic for many of us. So are we all okay on the tech side to start with you, Ruth? Yeah, amazing, great, perfect.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me and can you see my slides?
Oh. Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Just so you're aware, I'm talking. I can see my slides. I cannot see you. So if there are sort of any issues at all, please just you might have to just put your mic on and shout at me if it's okay. But yeah, so I am, good afternoon, everybody. It's really great to be here. I am based at the University of Exeter on their Cornwall campus, which is a very long way from Scotland, sadly. I feel that Cornwall shares many sort of the characteristics and the challenges around seafood and encouraging the diversification in terms of people's diets towards local and sustainable seafood resources. So maybe that's something that we can get into later. But for now, I want to talk to you about some of my research. Olivia mentioned I'm a marine historical ecologist, and this basically means I have the pleasure of spending a lot of my time looking through sort of written archives. I read anything from the 19th century that's to do with fish and seafood, old fishery reports, there's 19th century government commissions. I spend a lot of my time in newspapers. And the reason I'm doing this is to really try to reconstruct what our seas look like in the times before anybody was really monitoring them, in the times before our governments had sort of decided that fish was a resource that was worth sort of investing time in monitoring, but also really before ecology was an established discipline, or even sort of natural sciences had established many of their methods. So it's using sources that scientists today wouldn't necessarily turn to as sources of evidence, and looking about what these can tell us, critically analysing them for what they can tell us about managing our seas now and into the future. So I'm going to start off, hopefully I can move forward with my slides, talking about the seafood mismatch that occurs and that I'm sure many of you will be aware of, in that we have such a diverse range of fisheries and increasingly sort of aquaculture, but there is very much a mismatch in the types of seafood that and I'm talking generally, I know that there's often a lot more diversity on the coast and in coastal populations, but generally as a whole, folks in the UK, there's a mismatch in what we consume and what we produce. So this is a figure that came from Luke Harrison's paper back in 2023. Really happy to provide any of these paper links that I've put forward that maybe can be shared out to the group. But it shows the weight of fish and shellfish recorded as landed into the UK since the 19th century. So that's a red line. You can see this big dip, and that's the two world wars. And then you see this sort of dropping off, and particularly sort of from that 1970s period onwards. At the same time, we've had this rise in imports, as well as a rise in exports. So that's the blue and the yellow-orange line, respectively. And you've seen that sort of like that grew to meet that sort of that production I guess gap from that 1980s onwards. And of course, aquaculture, we've had that sort of steady increase and then sort of this leveling off as well. So basically, you've had this mismatch, which has deepened throughout the 20th century. And when you break that down by species, what we produce, what we import, what we export, so you've got what we produce on the top, and that we think stays in the UK. It's always a bit murky, but you've got your imports and you've got your exports, just sort of in that order. You can see sort of this shift from, we were landing sort of cod, haddock, herring-dominated industry. You see that most of the herring was exported in that bottom panel. And then we've sort of had the rise of mackerel and shellfish, whilst we're increasingly importing what you might term our traditional whitefish. And then, of course, there's been sort of new species added, like tuna and prawns, that are coming from quite far away. So we know the history of some of these species and why this has happened quite well, but there's other species, and also sort of this pre-20th century, what was happening then, are far less well known. And we also probably, I would argue, maybe know some of the key drivers, at least in recent decades, of that. But what's happening behind these landings and these policies of that sort of late 20th century? What's changed in our relationship in terms of what we catch, what we eat, and what are the outcomes of this for our marine ecosystems and our coastal communities? And I can't promise to answer all of that today in 20 minutes, but maybe just dig into a couple of little bits there. And where a lot of my research sort of starts from is certainly not the beginning of fishing, and it's not even the beginning of sort of the, I guess, intensification of fishing in certain localities, but it is really that dramatic shift in the 18th and 19th century of the Industrial Revolution. It was this key transformation point in so many of our industries. It was a key transformational point sort of in our sort of society, our economy. And when it comes to our seas, it was really that transformation occurred because of the railways. So they expanded in different places at different times, but essentially from the 1830s onwards, they were going into sort of these large sort of inland populations, and there was suddenly this swift route for fish as a very generally perishable species. Suddenly they could get a lot more seafood protein inland to urban populations that were rapidly growing larger. And at this point in those mid-1800 times, there was a real fear that there wasn't going to be enough protein for the working people in these inland areas, and seafood was seen as this potential solution. And so we had these sort of technological advancements, and this dramatically sort of increased the potential for seafood protein. It also, there was this increase in demand because our populations were growing, more people were surviving infancy. But this is far beyond most of our sort of scientific or even sort of our routinely collected government data, as I said. So without sort of looking back to this time, we do risk missing sort of these fundamental sort of transformations. And I will say that scientists in general, we weren't as quick enough on the uptake. And there were a few scientists who were calling for it, but then there wasn't the funding available back in the 19th century, still continuing today. But as a result, we didn't start properly monitoring until a long time ago. We weren't routinely collecting information. So data is a problem for this period of time, despite these fundamental shifts that you see on this page here. Another problem is the way in which we as a society sort of process collective insights and memory, in that we're not very good at it. And again, this is a very generic sort of broad brush example. Of course, there are locations, there are people, there are sort of cultures where they do this much better. But generally, there has been identified this phenomenon called the shifting baseline syndrome, which is where we as individuals have a habit of looking at the environment that when we first meet it, and sort of assuming that is largely natural or that is largely unchanged. And the seas, we can do that very, very easily, because most of us, unless you are fishing or you're foraging, you are not sort of trying to go under the water, and you're not that aware of that environment. And so these changes, they get collectively lost from our collective consciousness, I guess. And it effectively conceals past environmental changes. So this is where historical ecology comes in. Can we move from shifting to lifting our baselines, essentially? Can we get a fair basis for understanding what has changed to help use it to help inform what our considerations and our value judgments today to help inform those future decisions? So some of the sources I've used are sort of 19th century parliamentary inquiries, nautical charts, even logbooks, talking to people who've been through sort of huge changes themselves. And I mentioned about sort of newspapers and popular media. And there's all sorts of sources that we have used. I don't have time to get into this about the sort of the critical need to sort of think critically about these documents, why they were being written, why they've been saved. There's a whole sort of talk I could give about that, but really happy to answer any questions about that. But I'm going to go first of all to a piece of work by Zoe Hurd, who was a PhD student. She finished last year, and she did some great work looking at data that is available to us. It's in the Scottish government sort of fisheries records, and they go back really to around the 1890s. And a lot of fisheries management relies on records going back, maybe a handful of decades. But of course, we've been reshaping the seas far longer. And what she did was really look at sort of how this technology was changing behind sort of these shifts in sort of species supply and these changes in policy. And so she showed, first of all, thinking about the bottom fishing fleet, or demersal fishing, as we might call it. That became, first of all, big business in terms of steam trawlers. So railways paved the way for us to start using bottom trawlers, which at the time were beam. These were, first of all, generated by sail power. And then around the 1880s, steam power came into play. And within a decade, sail-powered trawlers were just going out of business. It was such a fast sort of shift. Scotland, this sort of came a little bit later, and you can see that within these statistics. So you've got the demersal trawl, which is in blue there in terms of the amounts of landings that they have. And you can see in green, you've got sort of the line fishing, because at this point in time, there was really a lot of sort of the demersal line fishing industry, catching these whitefish a lot of the time. And it was very labor intensive. It supported many coastal communities, for example, collecting of mussels and clams for bait. But you can see that shift going from this sort of demersal trawl. The big point in Scotland really came the otter trawl, which is where the doors sort of open out. And the environment around Scotland really wasn't suited for beam trawls, but otter trawls came in. And within a year, anyone who was using beam trawl changed to otter trawl around 1895. So it's just to sort of show that you have these big changes occurring quite early on, and certainly long before we think about sort of when we were collecting information on fisheries biomass, for example. We've got the same figure again, but this is for the pelagic fleet. So, and what you can see here is that drift nets, so this more passive method of fishing where you set the nets in the water, that dominated for far longer, up until the 1960s. And then you started getting these more sort of active methods. So that's the gears that sort of fish effectively under propulsion. So thinking about your pelagic trawl, you say net, things like that. And then there was also this shift to mackerel. And then you also see the shellfish industry. Again, you sort of have these more passive methods. There's a caveat with this one, in that there's a load of data that we don't have, which is possibly sort of dredging for species as well. But you do then get this shift towards these more sort of active methods, like the dredge and the nephrops trawl, for example. This also leaves out the case of the oysters, which I'll come on to in a moment, but which was not much of an industry by the time that these statistics began, but historically was just hugely important in places like Scotland. So I wanted to show you that to really sort of mention that, we can look at sort of changes in landings, but behind all of this is sort of these shifts in technology. We call it sometimes sort of technological creep because it happens sort of gradually, but there's also these periods of just great transformation that can happen really, really rapidly. And the impact of these is just so hard to quantify, if I can say that word, because nobody is really sort of assessing just how this has changed, but often there's these other big sort of shifts that come into play as well. But this doesn't even cover things that we've named here, the sort of the great acceleration, in terms of this is where motors came in, echo sound of synthetic materials. I've tried to quantify it in other fisheries. It's very, very hard to do. Some people have sort of have tried that as well. But effectively what it shows is it's a really sort of good way of sort of masking broader scale changes at the ecosystem level, sort of at the population level for these fisheries. And it also masks how fishermen and women have to effectively work harder to catch the same number of fish if you're in a system where there's sort of, there's too much sort of exploitation, or there's other ecosystem changes occurring as a result of these gears. But you are moving towards gears that are, sort of quite sort of impactful at that broader ecosystem scale in many of these cases. And also to point out that a lot of these were also actively subsidized by government. For example, financial assistance made available, converting the drift netting vessels to pelagic trawlers, for example, in the 1960s. And of course, that is important because it keeps people, when there's a fishery that is not happening anymore, that keeps that community going. But at the same time, it potentially, if there's not then sort of effective management from those changes, that can then, of course, cause problems later down the line. And you often see this repeating in sort of fisheries and across the board. So what does this mean for fisheries yields? So this is, apologies, this is sort of the UK overall. But so there's England and Wales there, and then in the clear is sort of UK ports, so that's almost all sort of Scotland on top of that. So this was a piece of work that I did a really long time ago now, but it was effectively reconstructing landings of bottom living fish, looking at the numbers of large trawlers that we had, and looking at what was being landed versus what was the sort of the fishing power that we had as a fleet, and trying to correct for that over time. So this at the moment is landings. So you can see the world wars, you can see sort of this like plateauing, but plateauing, and then you get this big drop off. And folks who know that history will know this as the Cod Wars. This is when we sort of entered the European exclusive economic zone. Towards later in that period, that's when quotas came into play. And we, at least, we sort of, in the English fleet at least, lost a lot of those sort of traditional fishing grounds as a result. But when you correct for sort of the fishing power, and this is essentially landings once corrected for every unit of trawl fishing power. So that takes into account the amount of power inherent within a single vessel, very broad brush. It's not accounting for all these little vessels and all these different changes, but also then the number in the fleet at the time. And you see this very different picture. So what you see is this sort of big drop off in those early years. That's when we were fishing largely in home waters. We didn't have the data for Scotland at that point. So this is mainly sort of this England and Wales, mainly the English fleet. And you can see this huge drop off. If you go to people talking about it at the time, there are a lot of trawl owners and fishers who are extremely concerned at this point. But then these broader open waters opened up, largely a result of steam power. People stopped worrying about it so much. We went to Iceland, we went to the far northern North Sea. Those became less available to us very quickly, and then it dropped off again. And what you see is that people are catching now, even accounting for quotas just before that time, people were sort of having to work a lot harder to catch those fish. I wanted to talk briefly about sort of the impact on seabed communities, because whilst we can look at sort of fisheries yields and we can broadly look at the changes that have occurred, what is much more hidden is what is happening to our seabed communities. Where that is slightly different is when you have a fishery that is attached to the seabed, like shellfish. So the native oyster is one that I have worked on, a fishery that I have worked on. And so when it came to Scotland, it was historically a very important fishery and a popular food. And today, that fishery really does not exist anymore. It's protected and a target for habitat restoration. And I wanted to focus on the Firth of Forth, just outside Edinburgh, which this was a particularly sort of important fishery. It was the most important commercial beds in Scotland from at least the 13th century onwards. There were statements that the oyster beds stretched for miles in length. Very hard to verify these, but they were certainly a significant fishery. And in the 1830s, and again, this is pre anyone really collecting information, so it's sort of taken sporadically from different places, but they spoke about landings of up to 6,000 oysters per boat per day. So that's an upper limit, but that's what people could land in boats that looked a little bit like this from the Illustrated London News, which is this is from about 30 years later, maybe, I think, yes. Maybe actually 10 years later, I can't remember. But what that meant was between 20 and 30 million oysters, possibly even over 30 million oysters, were being landed from this system per year at this point in time. And so obviously that was a huge fishery. Is in the 1850s and 60s, there were some government commissions. They took evidence and testimonies from fishermen, and they were very, very worried about this industry. They were extremely worried. But there was not much proactive management. In fact, there was none. And by the 1890s, it continued to decline. And by the 1890s, they were landing just 6,000 oysters per year. So contrast that with per boat per day at its peak. This was also the first time that any scientists got into the system and started sort of taking formal records. And what they found was after their first scientific survey, it was reasoned that there was less than 500,000 living oysters remaining in the Firth of Forth around 1895. They reckoned more like 250,000. So it was in a really, really bad state. And this was sort of not the only place where this was happening, of course. There was sort of transformations all over. And this was because oysters were so popular. There was so much consumer demand. There was so much unregulated fishing going on that it was, and it wasn't just people fishing the adult oysters. People were coming in from other places, notably the Thames, going far up to places like the Firth of Forth. They were coming in from the Netherlands as well. And they were taking the small oysters. They were taking the spat. So this is when things got really, really bad. But yeah, so it was basically this transformation occurred. And this was happening everywhere. This was happening across Europe. And really what I want to point out is that some of they weren't just individual oysters on the seabed, which is often what people think of as oysters today. They think of them sort of scattered. This is not what the historical record was telling us. They were forming living reefs. They were this three-dimensional, this sort of this habitat that supported many other species. And some of them covered thousands of kilometers squared. We don't know exactly what that looked like, but we know that it did. And in some cases, the transformation occurred extremely fast. So it took 20 boats, 7 years to dredge away the oysters. They were thick. One boat got 30,000 oysters in a week. That was for around the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea. So this transformation goes beyond oysters. This is a piece of work that is in review. So it's a very early sort of look, but this is some work that postdoc Kieran McClarity is looking at. And this is showing not dredgers, but trawlers and how they expanded. Now, again, this is very sort of taken from a high resolution. So obviously it's not got all of those details, but these are the grounds that were available to trawlers. And this is, take a look at the dates. This is before 1850, before 1900, that's steam power. And that's before 1930. So you have this transformation that's occurring long before the scientists and the government have got sort of their act together in terms of monitoring this. And that's resulted from us all sort of suffering from this shifted baseline. And I love oysters because they are this sentinel of this wider marine ecosystem change that has occurred. And how those changes have been lost from our collective memories. And there are so many efforts today to sort of restore. But I think sort of this sort of understanding sort of where we're at and where we've come from is really important. It's not me trying to say let's go back to how it once was. I'm not saying that necessarily, but what I think is important is to have this information available so that we can look at it and say, right, does this change how we want to act in the future collectively? What does this mean for sort of our understanding and our values and how we want to move forward? And also showing that, this change has not happened in a vacuum. There's all these broader drivers that have driven this. But just sort of how that sort of impacts down the line. And I will just so really to summarize, because I know I'm going over my time a bit, but these past perspectives for me are maybe just help us sort of look at, are the policies that we have today, are they fit for purpose? Should we be thinking bigger and better? What should we be doing? What's sort of a fair and just way forward? But they also show sort of the urgency and the need for action. And help us, I guess, come to understand more and discuss more explicitly sort of the economic and the societal trade-offs that might need to occur. And in terms of making informed decisions about what we want and how we balance those trade-offs. And one of these is sort of oyster restoration. You know, it's occurring now, and that's fantastic. It's in the early days, but they talk about scales of a hectare or less. There were very few instances in the historical record where, when they described reefs, that they were ever describing them as less than 10 hectares in extent. So that's not a call to say that we need to be trying to, you know, necessarily be going straight for that, but it's like, where do we want to end up in the future? How should this raise our ambitions in, you know, as we move forward? And I think, you know, this is sort of a guide and to help us have those informed discussions. And because otherwise, what sort of counts as normal with our seas and our expectations, it shifts with every single generation that we have. And so where do we want to go from here if we sort of bring this knowledge back to bear into our discussions? And with that, I'll say a massive thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I'm very aware that 20 minutes for a lecture on history is very, very limited. So thanks so much for doing that. Yeah, and now I'll pass over to John.
Okay, thank you very much, as Ruth said, for inviting me to take part in this initiative. I'm delighted to be here. What I want to do is to look at the culture, the historical culture of fishing. I'm going to look, first of all, at Shetland, and then I'm going to look more widely at Scotland. And having had that perspective on the past for both places, I'll then conclude with a few thoughts about the future. So I'm going to start, as Diana said, I've worked in the seafood industry all my life, and in recent years I've written a few books, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my first book, The Salt Roads. And this book looks at how Shetland was connected to Europe throughout history as a result of the sea and the fishing. And it was interesting, Ruth's presentation about how the disconnect between what we catch and what we eat at home and what we export. In my book, I look at 300 years of Shetland history, and Shetland has always exported its fish to Europe, whether that was salt herring to Poland, Germany, or Russia, or whether it was salt, cod, and ling to Spain and Portugal. So there's always been, I think, in the history of fishing, not only in Shetland, Scotland, but throughout Europe, exporting has always been a big part of that. The idea that we've always caught what was consumed locally hasn't really been the case. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my book to begin with, The Salt Roads. And as you can see, it's subtitled How Fish Made a Culture. And this book is all about this history of fishing in Shetland, which linked Shetland to Europe. But it's not a book about tonnages or boats. It's a book about the cultural impact of fish and fishing, hence the subtitle, How Fish Made a Culture. So the next slide, please. And as in this book, I weave in this book how fishing has inspired many artists from many countries over many years. Novelists, poets, filmmakers, musicians, visual artists, sculptors, and so on. And one of my favorite novelists is an Icelander called Halldór Laxness. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature for his famous novel, Independent People. If you haven't read him, I would really urge you. He's a wonderful novelist. That's his most well-known novel. My favorite, however, is a novel called Salkavalda. And this novel is set in an Icelandic fishing community in the 1930s. And like all of Laxness' novels, he deals with big moral and philosophical issues in the most ordinary of circumstances. So this novel is about Salka, this gutsy young woman who moves to the fishing community. And it's a novel about feminism. It's a novel about gender identity. It's a novel about industrial relations, the merchants, the fishermen, and the fish workers. And all of that is woven into this novel. And right in the middle of this novel is the most memorable phrase which Laxness uses. And he says, when all is said and done, life is first and foremost about fish. Now, that might strike us as a rather bizarre phrase, but for communities in the North Atlantic, then and now, life is first and foremost about fish. It's communities where fishing dominates. And that was certainly the case in places like Shetland, Faroe, the west coast of Norway, and Iceland, and many communities in Scotland. So, in this novel, in my book, I look at how exports of fish from Shetland to Europe made Shetland an international community, how the sea was actually a road that united us with the rest of Europe. You know, if you look at a modern map, you see Shetland as a little island. It looks remote, and that's because we always look at maps through a land-based perspective. Gosh, there's no roads there, there's no railways there. But if you look at a map through a sea perspective, Shetland is in the middle of the North Atlantic, very, very much linked to all of these communities. Shetlanders fished at Iceland, they fished at Faroe, they fished around Shetland, and they exported their fish to over 300 years to Eastern Europe and to Southern Europe. And as I've mentioned throughout this novel, throughout this book, I'm keeping talking about novel because I'm thinking about Laxness. Throughout this book, I look at how fishing inspired artists. I've mentioned Laxness. Another novelist I deal with in my book is Neil Gunn, whose book, The Silver Darlings, was a novel chronicling the early days of the Scottish herring fishery in the Moray Firth. Wonderful novel. I also have a couple of chapters looking at the work of Mykonos, Samuel Johannesson from the Faroe Islands, Faroe's most celebrated artist, and he chronicled the cod fishermen of Faroe over many years, their lives, the weather they fished in, and of course the many tragedies when one of these cod smacks was lost. I also look at the years which probably Scotland's second most famous poet, Hugh MacDiarmid, second only to Robbie Burns. Hugh MacDiarmid spent 8 years living in Shetland in the 1930s on the island of Walsa, one of the most important fishing communities in Shetland. And when he was in Shetland during these years, he went fishing herring with local fishermen, and he wrote some of his best works during that period, including On a Raised Beach, an incredible piece of Scottish poetry. He was writing in English and in Scots at this time, and was part of the Scottish literary Renaissance in the 1930s and 40s. And finally, just I cover many more, but another artist who was inspired by fishing was John Grierson, the famous Scottish filmmaker who in the 1920s made this documentary, wasn't even called a documentary then, called Drifters. Go on YouTube, put in Grierson Drifters, and it's very short, only about 40 minutes. And it's a silent black and white film about the early days of steam in the Scottish herring fishery. And what's important about it from a cinematic point of view is it set the template for all future documentaries. You know, this was more than 100 years ago, but all documentaries we see today follow the format that he established with that wonderful documentary about fishing. So, fishing in Shetland, fishing in Europe has inspired many, many people. It's been really important. And how my book essentially addresses the question of how fishing has shaped the history of Shetland, has created a culture, and not only historically, but still the culture that underpins Shetland today. There's probably not a family, not a single family in Shetland that doesn't have a historical or contemporary connection with the fishing industry in one shape or another. And this very much influences the way that people think. Now, of course, the sea means so much to so many people. It's 75% of our globe. But for people in communities like Shetland and elsewhere in Scotland, the sea does two things. It provides food and it provides employment, two incredibly important things. And in Shetland, next slide, please. In Shetland, we celebrate our cultural and fishing heritage in many ways. And I had to share this slide. The Shetland community owns the Swan. This is a sail herring vessel that was built in Shetland 125 years ago. And it's been restored to how it was at that time. And every summer it sails from Shetland to Scotland, to Norway, to Faroe, to Iceland. It sails around the North Sea and North Atlantic. It takes hundreds of people on board, especially school children from Shetland. And it tries to do two things. First of all, to pass on the skills of sailing a large, heavy herring smack under sail. But secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, it passes on our precious fishing heritage to the next generation of young Shetlanders. So next slide, please. So my book covers Shetland. The same can be said about Scotland. Fishing has been central to coastal and island Scotland for a very, very long time. It remains very important. And we probably now should include fish farming as part of that cultural heritage, because fish farming now has a 50-year history in Scotland, and we probably should be talking about the seafood industry rather than just the fishing industry. And I just want to make a few remarks about this cultural heritage. It's incredibly important from a cultural heritage and society point of view, and it can't really be monetized. You can't really put a value on it. But what we can, I think, say is if it's fossilized and it changes, it's lost. Two of my favourite villages in Scotland are Anstruther and Pittenweem. And if you go to Anstruther, it's got the Scottish Fisheries Museum, it's got a few great fish and chip shop, lots of nice shops, restaurants. It's got a wonderful marina in the old historical harbour, and it's a lovely, tidy, touristy place. But there's not a single fishing boat fishing out of Anstruther now. It's reliving its fishing culture and heritage through a connection that's now gone. And in many ways, that's very sad. Walk or drive a few miles west and you come to Pittenweem. Completely different atmosphere. As soon as you walk around the harbour in Pittenweem, it's a little bit smelly, it's a little bit untidy. There's nets around, there's boxes around, you can smell fish, you can smell diesel, and there's a fish market with fish and prawns being landed. It's a living culture. And I think in Scotland as a whole, when we look at our fishing heritage and culture, if we're going to preserve this valuable heritage and culture, it's got to be a living culture, or else there's so much that's lost. Next slide, please. And some people would say, well, of course, fishing, seafood, it's an important industry, but the same could be said for any industry in Scotland. And that's right, I accept that. But I think fishing and seafood is different. It is a way of life. It's not like an office job. It's not like many other kind of jobs. And here's just a quite dramatic photograph of a modern Scottish trawler going through rough weather, not unusual weather. And if you talk to somebody who's been a fisherman all his life, he will recall a life at sea. He'll maybe think back to a year when there were good catches, when prices were high, and that year allowed him perhaps to pay off his mortgage. He'll remember that. He'll think back to other years when times were tough, when economies had to be made. And then he'll maybe think back to the many storms he's been in. And he'll think back to perhaps one particular storm where he literally feared for his life. And he'll think back to that boat and the way that that boat effectively saved his life and got him through the storm. So the relationship between a fisherman, between a fisher and their boat is so very, very important. And it's a relationship that doesn't exist in other industries. No one has that relationship with an office that they worked in as a fisherman does with his boat. One story of in the village I grew up in, Shetland, Hamnavoe, our next door neighbour, he'd been a fisherman all his life. When he came to sell his boat was, he'd had 40 years history with his partners on this boat. When they came to sell the boat, she was sold to the west coast of Scotland. And once all the formalities were done and she left the pier, his house overlooked the pier and also overlooked essentially the North Atlantic. And I saw him standing in his window watching his boat, had been part of his family for 40 years, leave the harbour and slowly wind its way out into the open sea. And he stood at that window for 2 hours until the boat eventually disappeared. It became smaller and smaller and smaller and eventually disappeared over the horizon. And that's the kind of relationship that fishermen have with their boats. And that kind of leads to the cultural heritage we have. So the next slide, please, and I'll be very, very quick. I asked the question in this final slide, Scotland without a seafood industry. It would be unthinkable, and I hope would be unacceptable. And I think it would be. We would lose this valuable cultural heritage. And I think how unacceptable that is to wider Scottish society was illustrated when Skipponish produced their famous track, The Clearances Again, several years ago. And that was written very much in protest at the ill thought out proposal by the Scottish government to introduce highly protected marine areas in 10% of Scottish waters. It became an instant hit, and I think it became a huge hit because it spoke to that part of Scotland that still appreciates and understands that without a seafood industry, coastal and island Scotland would have lost something that's quite precious. But of course, we don't have to lose our seafood industry. There is a very good, sustainable and profitable future ahead. There are huge opportunities. Of course, there are challenges. And as I said when I started, I really welcome the Fish Plus initiative. And I think the discussions you're going on to have are going to be so important. And I would just pitch one final thought into those future discussions, that to seize the opportunity and to embrace the huge potential for sustainable fishing in Scotland in the future, and to address the challenges that we have, we must all avoid simple solutions. There's a great danger in seeing a complex problem and coming up with a very simple solution. Invariably, they make the situation worse. So I leave that kind of slightly different thought with you. And final slide, please. And so, yes, that's a very, very quick run through fishing history and how, as I say in my book, how fish has actually made a culture. So thank you.
Thank you very much, John and Ruth. And thanks, Ruth, for taking us through that very long-term history and just, yeah, reflecting on how different technological changes that we might not even notice might be impacting our ecosystems. And then, John, thanks so much for bringing in this human perspective as well, and this connection that people have with the ocean and with their livelihoods, which is also obviously really important as we make policy in Scotland towards a good food nation. So I'd like to now open the floor to any questions that there might be. Feel free to raise your virtual hand or your hand. Now look around. Perfect. So we have the first question from Phil.
Thanks, Deanna. Thanks, John, and thanks, Ruth. Really appreciate your presentations. It was great to see today. So as the Fish Plus panel, we've been asked to try and think about what policies we think should be in a good seafood nation. And I think that both of your presentations were fantastic for context, but I think that that question still stems from both. John, you've challenged that simple solutions aren't the answer. And Ruth, you've presented really a complex and sadly a history of decline that may continue in that direction if action's not taken. What are the actions that you would like to see each in a good seafood nation plan? Thank you.
Who would like to go first for that one? John, I see you're not on mute, so I'm going to pick on you. And then if you want to go for it, Ruth after.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And I think that essentially, I guess Ruth and I were providing the historical context as to why fishing is important. Looking to the future and I guess the end point of your Fish Plus series of seminars, it's important to come up with what, in fact, is needed to ensure that we can fully realize the undoubted potential which exists. So what would I say that would look like? I think there's the outcome and there's the process. First of all, the process. It's absolutely essential that it's bottom up and not top down. I think top down solutions, either from governments or from NGOs or from well-meaning celebrities, invariably don't work. The fisheries management solutions that do work, and I think there's plenty of evidence of that, are the ones that come from bottom up, that are discussed by the people living in the communities and the stakeholders and wider communities living in those communities. So I think in process, it's absolutely essential that we have bottom up solutions rather than top down solutions which are imposed. In terms of what that would look like, I think you used the term, Phil, a history of decline. It's a history of change, perhaps, rather than a history of decline. Different species are caught now than were caught previously. Some of Ruth's really interesting stats covered huge landings of cod and haddock, but most of those were coming from Iceland, North Norway, and Faroe, not from UK waters. One of the huge expansions in recent years has been the mackerel fishery, which is, to some extent has replaced the herring fishery. And, I think we're used to looking at an industry in decline, and it's not always the case. I'll take mackerel as an example. There's an issue with mackerel and international management at the moment, which needs to be addressed. MSC certification has been withdrawn. While that's hopefully being addressed, it's on this occasion, the fault is not laid at the door of the fishers, it's laid at the door of the governments, whether they be Faroese, Icelandic, Norwegian, EU or UK, unable to reach international agreements. But just focusing on Scotland, for an example. Scotland gets a big mackerel quota. It mostly goes to big, I think 25 big pelagic trawlers, very profitable fishery. Scottish government, about 8 years ago, introduced something called top slicing. They took 1,000 tonnes off the total Scottish quota of 87,000 tonnes or whatever it was at the time. And that 1,000 tonnes has been allocated to under 10-metre boats fishing mackerel with handlines. When that was introduced, I think there were about 5 of these handline mackerel fishing boats in Shetland. Last year, there were 230. It's a huge expansion in part of our industry. So it's not an industry of decline. There's more people employed catching mackerel now than was the case 8 years ago. And it's paralleled in other parts of Scotland. So that's one example in terms of the outcome, that there's lots of good news stories, but we've got to get the right fisheries management measures in place with the stakeholders bottom up to ensure that that's the case. So that's one little bit of credit to a government department for doing something which has had far-reaching economic and social consequences. So.
Thank you, John. Ruth, if you would like to come in with your visions for the future, and I'm aware we have 4 more questions, so I'll take those after.
Yeah, I think just to say that I probably am not a very good person to talk about what the policies should be. I don't feel that I have that sort of expertise. And I think John's made a lot of really sort of relevant points there, and I think that sort of that having a real and informed consultation that is actually consultation is just so important in getting all of those communities affected. I think I'd also agree with John that there's so many the fisheries are so diverse, and it is an industry that has always changed and has been so adaptable and so resilient in many ways. And there's also just it's so varied that there's so many sustainable practices going on, and like John says, those good news stories. I think this thing about decline, I know, and obviously talking about it very broadly, trying to look at Scotland overall in 20 minutes is not ideal. But I think just to say that, I guess where I sort of grow concerned is that there has been sort of real, and I would say sustained decline in certain sort of particularly ecological metrics, which then what happens with the social and the economic side of it is sometimes decline, it's sometimes reinvention. So then it's not decline anymore, there's something different. But I think where I would caution is saying when you look back, there really have been these significant changes, and going back in time and turning ourselves around back to that time is possibly not the answer. We probably can't do it. But I think it's just to be aware that it is there are these certain, I would argue that there have been declines, and they have been sort of quite sustained and also just but transformational, so that people have adapted and have been enormously resilient. But there's only so much that people can continue to be resilient, I would argue as well. And just to say that as well, there's also other evidence that sort of talks about sort of broader sort of, smaller scale changes in those inshore areas as well, which I didn't bring in. So it's just to sort of clarify that that point on from my point of view. But I think I'm going to sort of hesitate to answer more specifically like that great question. So I don't feel I'm an expert in that.
Thank you, Ruth. And maybe I'll take both Neil's and David's question. Neil, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I've got a couple of bits. First of all, again, brilliant presentations. John, I don't think I've met you, but I do know Wilma through a bike ride I did last year, and I think you know my father-in-law as well. But I suppose my questions are, so in Scotland, we obviously catch and produce huge amounts of fish, but a lot of people still have limited access to locally sourced seafood. And I appreciate what John was saying, that this has long been the case, that the fish is exported. But is there lessons we can learn from history that we can reconnect people with local production of fish? And my other point is, so obviously we're looking at the Good Food Nation in Scotland, but if fish are caught in Scotland and then shipped somewhere else to be processed and then bought back into Scotland, where does that economic value sit, and what opportunities do we have to keep that value within Scotland?
Yeah, two really good questions. Shall I go first? And is that okay? Limited access to local seafood. I think this is a central question for Fish Plus to try and address. We've got a wealth of seafood, and very often it's just a mile away. It's and how do you access that? And I think part of it is other than there's a kind of when I grew up, we never bought fish. I still rarely buy fish. I catch a lot of my own, and I know people who catch. So I'm very lucky. I'm very incredibly fortunate to live in a community where that still happens. But in most of the rest of Scotland, that doesn't take place, and so we've got to make that available. But there's a kind of a disconnect now for lots of people living in an urban setting. Fish is either a fish supper, or it's a ready meal from a supermarket, or it's a special meal out in a restaurant. The days of going to a fishmonger and taking home fish and preparing it yourself, most people have lost those skills. If you go to other parts of Europe, if you go to Spain, you hardly find a ready meal. The Spanish consumer still buys chunks of monkfish or cod or tuna and takes it home and prepares it. And the Spanish consumer doesn't appear to be at all perturbed by bones or scales or eyes, and they just prepare. So we've lost that in Scotland, and we've got to bring that back somehow. That I don't know how that's done. Fish Plus That's, I think, a challenge for you guys to try and come up with. But I would agree with you. We've got to improve local access to local seafood. A couple of weeks ago in Shetland, there was a seafood festival in Lerwick. I don't know if you went there. Enormously successful. There was barbecues, all local seafood, and bringing that local seafood available to local population. Those kind of seafood events where people who normally only ever eat a ready meal or a fish supper come and they maybe eat some scallop kebabs or they have some fried herring and then they think, gosh, that was really nice. Wonder where I could buy that and cook it myself. So I think that's really important. The situation where you have the crazy situation of fish being caught in Scotland and maybe leaving Scotland to be processed and then coming back. It's crazy. It's crazy for many reasons from an employment point of view. It's also crazy from a carbon footprint point of view. One of the huge, huge benefits that seafood has over other proteins and land-based proteins is its incredibly low carbon footprint. To produce beef, you're emitting 60 kilos of greenhouse gases for a kilo of beef. For lamb and pork, it's 12 to 15. For chicken, it's maybe 8. For most seafood, it ranges from 1 to 3. Our carbon footprint is incredibly low. But if we start exporting fish, having it processed elsewhere, and then importing it back, that just pushes the carbon footprint off and we lose our ecological and environmental competitive advantage. So we've got to avoid that as far as possible. Scottish Government has introduced the landings obligation, whereby 75% of all pelagic fish that's caught must now be landed in Scotland and not landed to processing plants in Norway or elsewhere. It's resisted by the catching sector, but I think I can understand some of the opposition. But in actual fact, it's a policy measure that makes a lot of sense.
Just to add, I think there's increasing amounts of research out there that's looking at who eats seafood and what are the sort of like the demographic sort of associations of who's eating seafood. It's kind of in early stages, but there's more and more coming out every year, and so I think it's well worth sort of keeping an eye on that literature. That's something that I also try to do. But what I will say is there's also so many across in sort of many different locations. There's lots and lots of often grassroots efforts to get people to eat more of the local fish. And I think one of the problems is that there's so much going on there, but there's very few people sort of connecting those different initiatives. And that what is very difficult to do as well is to see how well they've worked, is to look at down the line and say, you went into schools, you got them sort of cooking. There was all this sort of anecdotal information that they went back to their parents and they were saying, yes, let's get mussels. But then does that continue? And does that then go back up the generations who are sort of perhaps less plastic in their preferences? So that is a real, I think, research gap, is something I'm very interested in myself. But I think that it can also be sort of looked at more maybe that's something that's worth sort of looking to, and there's places like the Fishmongers Guild. They've done a lot of work in the past, often going to schools and things like that. So it might be worthwhile connecting, and even if it's anecdotal, just saying, how well did that go? Has there been any follow-up? And maybe collecting that, like Deanna and Olivia, that might be something that could be brought in as information.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm gonna take 2 questions this time. So first, David, can you share your question, please? You're on mute. You're still on mute. Oh, I think you went off mute and then back on mute. I'm not sure.
That's it.
That's it. Perfect. Great. Cool.
Yes, technologically deficient. Thanks very much for organising this, Diana, and thanks very much for 2 very interesting perspectives. Just one point, I think it's so, I live between Glasgow and Gia. It's so difficult to access fresh fish. Every high street used to have a fishmonger.
I can name about 4 fishmongers in Glasgow at the moment where you can, apart from supermarkets. But my main question was, can we incorporate Scottish seaweed into this conversation? It's something that I'm particularly interested in.
Thank you, David. Kelly, do you want to share your question as well?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Ruth, John. Really great presentations. Thank you. If you don't know me, I think John does. I'm the shellfish ambassador for Scotland. I was at the Taste of Shetland event a couple of weeks ago. It was fantastic, by the way. The queue at the food truck, which was all fish, was so long, all day long. So really good to see that. But my question back to you both. It's a really simple question. You know, we have got a difficult task ahead for the Fish Plus panel in getting this atlas together, in terms of recommending what species and informing about those species. So thinking about past and present, what species would you both have in that atlas? What would be a deal breaker for you?
Thanks, Kelly. And maybe I'll take yours as well, Anna.
Thanks, Diana, and thank you both for the amazing presentations. And I loved John's story of Anstruther and Pittenweem. I live in Fife, so I think it's no coincidence that Anstruther, alongside a vibrant fishing community, has also a very vibrant artistic community. I think these two things kind of come together. But I was also struck by this sort of picture of the vessel that you showed, this kind of historic vessel that was recreated and continues to take kids out, etc. And I'm just wondering, to what extent are we telling ourselves a story about a fishing industry that looks very different from what it used to? And, to what extent, how is that shaping the kind of current modern narratives around environment, biodiversity, how our communities, I guess, reacting to some of the criticism that comes, and also kind of the nuance of kind of talking to coastal communities, but also the big kind of corporate multinational voices that tend to be also quite loud in these conversations. How do you see those dynamics playing out in all of that? Sorry, like a really long, complicated question, but thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So we have, Anna's questions on different voices and power in the sector, as well as the different stories we tell ourselves. Then we have the question on seaweed. What's the role of seaweed within all of this? I should also mention, David, we do have Rihanna Rees, who's the CEO for Seaweed Scotland, as part of the steering group. So just so you know, seaweed will be part of this. But in case John or Ruth, you want to add anything on that, please do. And then we have Kelly's question on if you were to recommend different species, are there any that would be deal breakers for you? So who would like to go first? Maybe Ruth this time?
Yeah, in terms of the species, I'd be hesitant to choose like a particular few, because for me it'd be thinking about the trade-offs, like what the balance is, and again, this is sort of part of, the way our news cycle has gone, the way a lot of our online discourse has gone. It's always gone to these sort of like one extreme or the other, and it's just very black and white, isn't it? Whereas actually, I think what we really need to come back to is this trade-off where, if it has great societal value or could do, and if it has this cultural value that we're wanting to maintain and keep alive, and I guess this is where sort of our values come in. Where do we want to be in the future? And then the ecological, I guess toll that it takes, in terms of the methods that are used, and can we sort of shift those methods? Are there ways to incentivize getting it into methods where that ecological toll is sort of neutralized, or even benefits in some cases, in terms of some shellfish and seaweed aquaculture, for example? So that for me would be a case of less a species. It would be, how is it caught, how much benefit is it giving to that local community, and how important is it to us to keep that community sort of going into the future? And I feel that tastes are malleable. A bit of a side gig I do is looking at old recipes and looking at sort of recipes through time. Can't tear myself away. And as John said, some, like, it used to be whole fish. It used to be go to your fishmonger if you don't know how to do this. Whereas now we've lost that. So, but it also does show that people were, at least in recipes, they were exposed to, this broad range of species. Whereas now, depending on where you look, it's much narrower. Not everywhere, but there is sort of this. There has been this trend. That's just another bit that I didn't talk about. But so I guess my point would be is rather than the species, I'd be looking at it through sort of those different angles and saying, like, where are the trade-offs and where do we want to be? And it's just making those choices explicit, right? We can have the conversation as to what we want to do collectively, and people will probably make different choices. But can we make those explicit? So I'm sorry I didn't answer that question very well, but that's sort of where I'd be. I've dodged it. Yeah, John.
Yeah, I think, Ruth, I would completely endorse what you've said in respect of, what choices should be in the atlas. I think the challenge to Fish Plus is to be honest and to cover all species, the ups, the downs, the pros and the cons. On seaweed, David, absolutely agree. Seaweed is part of the future, not only as a product which can be eaten in many ways and in many cultures, not so much traditionally, but very much it's like sushi. It's like a new fish culture, which Scotland has embraced and hopefully will embrace seaweed as well. But more importantly, seaweed's got this tremendous potential for carbon sequestration, which at times of climate change, we've got to look at every method we can of reducing our carbon footprint. So seaweed cultivation has this additional carbon sequestration potential. Anna, if I could come to your question, the point you made about artists and Anstruther, I believe, and I think I tried to bring that out in my book, The Salt Roads, there is an incredible connection between the sea and artists and thereby fishing communities and artists. And you can just look around the world, Gloucester in the United States, Skagen in Denmark, St. Ives in Cornwall, Anstruther and even Shetland and many communities in Faroe. You've got these places where boats are still going to sea and fish are still being landed and there's fish factories and there's nets being manned and then there's several artists working alongside. It's the kind of I don't know why it is. I think it's wonderful that the sea and the working on the sea and making a living from the sea still inspires many artists. So I think it's wonderful. The photograph of the swan I used, the old restored boat, it's there's only two in Scotland left, these old herring boats. One is the Reaper that lies alongside the pier in Anstruther, which is wonderful. And the other one is the Swan. There used to be 10,000 of these in Scotland, 10,000 of these sail herring boats, and two have been restored. There's none left, just these two. But the big difference between the two is that the Anstruther, the Reaper based in Anstruther, is kind of a floating part of the museum. It's never made part of its activity taking people to sea, especially school children. The Swan is completely different. We have a young skipper, young volunteer crew, and take lots of people to sea in order to take the Swan to being part of an ongoing, continuous fishing heritage, not part of as a floating museum. I mean, the Reaper, don't get me wrong, I love the Reaper. They've done a great job of fixing her up. And every time I go to Anstruther, I always take another photograph of the Reaper. I just love the lines. It's a beautiful boat, but they haven't done what we've done in Shetland by making it a living piece of our heritage. And some of the young school kids that have gone on the Swan and have been inspired by being at sea on this old boat, which is now completely and utterly outdated. It's powered by sails. Some of these people have gone on to become the skippers of the future and are now part of the Shetland fishing industry of today with all its technology. So there shouldn't be a disconnect between the old and the new. It's all part of a heritage program. It's all part of, you only know where you are if you know where you've come from. The technological change has just been mind-blowing. There's no comparison between old and new. but I think it's important that everybody in this modern industry recognizes where they've come from.
Thank you, John. We have two more questions coming up, so I'll take both of them. So first Ed and then Nick.
Hello. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. I thought there was a real nice balance between the two narratives. And this is, I guess, on the topic of, well, what we've been talking about. It was a long time ago that I read a book called Feral by George Monbiot. Now, I'm from South Wales, where there's a big sheep farming kind of like tradition and heritage. And I thought it was, his book was all about the case for rewilding quite a long time ago. I think it kind of inspired a big part of the rewilding movement. And I think the book concluded with like him interviewing some of the sheep farmers around Wales. And I know this might be a simplification of it, but kind of like, is there a way where the fishers who are doing it for the kind of like cultural kind of traditions are able to keep fishing, and more regulations on the kind of more industrialized versions of fishing that are exploiting or overexploiting our oceans? I don't know if that's something that's possible or discussed, but I just think it's interesting that maybe there's comparisons with other land-based forms of agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Nick, can we hear your question?
Sure, thanks to Hannah, and hi, and thanks to the presenters as well. Yeah, I suppose I just wanted to flag or understand the presenters' views and thoughts around some of the potential trade-offs and tensions within the seafood industry itself. John, you touched on the fact that salmon farming now has a sort of 50-year heritage within Scotland, and obviously it's a very significant high-value export for Scotland. But there are significant issues that we're all well aware of, and many people are well aware of. One big tension, I think, is that global investor networks. This is not sort of conservationists saying it. It is the sort of the people that care about the future bottom lines of the salmon farming industry. They concluded that the salmon farm aquaculture industry did not have a robust strategy to reduce its reliance on wild caught fish for its feed, and that that same investor network notes that 90% of our global marine fish stocks are already either fully exploited or overexploited, and that we're still continuing to increase the use of fish meal and fish oil for salmon. And so there are some significant sort of biodiversity and supply chain risks. They're almost the same thing. So I guess it was really just, do you share that concern about, it's a major sector in Scotland. Do you share the concern about its reliance on wild caught fish?
I'll take that one first, Ruth, and then you can come in. I think the seafood industry as a whole faces many challenges, and fish farming and fishing both are not beyond criticism. And the industry has got, fishing and fish farming strive to become better. Absolutely. I don't think many people would disagree with that. Both industries have moved very far, but both have a long way to go. However, the narrative that the Scottish salmon industry is reliant on the catch of wild fish, I don't recognise. Less than 10% of the feed that's used to make salmon feed, less than 10% of the raw material comes from fish. And hardly any of that comes from wild fish. Most of it comes from what is called trimmings. And that's the bits in the fish factories, the heads, the guts, the bone, the tail, the skin, all the bits that we don't eat is then made into fish meal and oil, and that then goes into making up salmon feed. It's called the circular economy. We're using the bits that normally we don't eat to then go into a food source to produce fish that we do eat. And anyway, it's less than 10%. So I'm not here to defend the salmon industry or the fishing industry, but I certainly don't recognize that the salmon industry globally is dependent on the catch of wild fish because it's such a small proportion of the total. As far as Europe is concerned, most of it comes from trimmings. In terms of other parts of the globe, the big wild fish industrial fishery that 6-7 million tons a year is the Peruvian anchoveta fishery. We consume less than 1% of Peruvian anchovies. It just isn't something that we like eating. Other than on a pizza, it's just so strong and it's so oily. It's mostly used to make fish meal and oil. It's on the cusp of being certified for as a well-managed sustainable fishery. So I don't duck the fact, Nick, that fishing and fish farming, there are many challenges and we've got to work together to address that. But I don't recognize this dependence on wild fisheries at all. The facts just don't bear it out. And this phrase that's 90% of global fish stocks are either overexploited or fully exploited. Well, surely where we want to be, we don't want to overexploit stocks, but I think it's 20% are managed and certified by MSC, and about 50% of global fisheries are fully exploited, and about 30% are overexploited. 30% overexploited, disaster. We've got to do something about it. But the 50% that are fully exploited, surely that's where we want to be. We want to derive the greatest amount of food that we can without jeopardizing the future of the stock. So fully exploited isn't the bad word that it sometimes appears to be, and it's sometimes used overexploited or fully exploited. It's a huge difference between the two.
Thank you, John. I'm conscious of time. We have 5 minutes left. So it'd be great to hear from you, Ruth, and also maybe on Ed's question on this, like balancing this fishing and culture with environmental and ecosystems.
Yeah. So I can't really sort of talk to the wild fish reliance. So I'm afraid I can't talk to that. But one thing I would say is when you look at the sort of the fisheries statistics, we export a lot of our Scottish produced farm salmon, but then we also import it to feed ourselves. So of course we're eating sort of Scottish farm salmon, but we're also eating it from Norway and Chile and places like that. So all I'd say is what I don't know is sort of the situation in places like Chile, and also why we would, I guess we export because of the branding and maybe you get more money, things like that. But again, it's sort of it's interesting because then obviously Scotland are doing sort of one thing in terms of their salmon farming. They've got those regulations, but people aren't always eating that in Scotland. So again, just a sort of one of those strange things. I would say on sort of the fisheries management, the other thing that I often think about is that fisheries management traditionally is very much single species, single stock focused. And there's a sort of good sort of historical reasons and legacies for that. But also to say that it's only sort of really now beginning to be, I say recently beginning to be recognized that, of course, there's just so many broader impacts. And sometimes those broader impacts are going to have indirect effects on the stocks that you are managing. So I guess, and I sort of say that to sort of circle back to Ed's comment about sort of whether there can be sort of different regulations for small scale fishers. I think one of the problems historically is that small scale fishing has been, whilst highly visible to anyone who goes and visits the coast, because it's a small scale fishers who are on the coast and they are visible and they are in those ports. When it came to sort of government and governance and scientific monitoring, it's the small scale fisheries that have historically been far less visible. And of course, then that has what has happened there is that we've had this problem where when it came to quotas, people within the small scale sectors have historically been pushed out a lot more. They haven't had sort of that negotiating power. They haven't had that sort of visibility as a sector. And I think that's only recently beginning to change. So I think there's a lot that could be happening in the future with the small scale sector. And I think in terms of linking those societal benefits and those cultures, and I'm not demonizing those larger scale sectors at all. I don't mean to, be saying that, but just to say that I think that small scale sector historically has been under-resourced, it has been ignored, and it's also just been sort of marginalized. And I think that is now certainly changing within sort of research, but only slowly. And hopefully that is something that is being changed slowly in government and governance as well. But I think something to really be aware of, because, and that's why we've got so much diversity still, is through a lot of these small scale fisheries as well. They're the ones who are working and having so many diverse practices that aren't as, you know, aren't as impactful as some of these larger scale industries can be.
Great. So we're at 2:29 now. So I just really want to thank both John and Ruth for your presentations and responding to all these questions. I know we started with history, and then obviously there's all these questions that come up and what are we going to do now? So thank you so much for taking them so well. And so, yeah, just really great to hear from both of you. And thanks for everyone for sticking with us for this lunchtime webinar. So this was the first one of a series of public webinars. So we will share when we have the next ones coming up. And we look forward to sharing the finished publication with you in early 2027. So thanks so much for joining, and we hope you have a good rest of your days.
Thanks so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.